You did everything right. You went to college, you got the job, you bought the house, you raised the kids, paid the bills on time, put a little away every single month into that 401k your HR department set up on day one. You never missed a payment. You never gambled it away in Vegas. You did what everyone told you to do. So why does retirement still feel far away? Not close, not secure, just far away, like a shore you can see but can't quite reach. Here's the thing, nobody tells you at 45, at 50, even at 55. There's a trap, not a scam, not a market crash. Something quieter than that. Something that doesn't announce itself. It just sits there, in your spending habits, in your assumptions, in the math you never actually did. And by the time you notice it, you're standing at the edge of retirement with a lot less runway than you thought you had. 9 out of 10 Americans over 40 are walking straight into it right now. Not because they're careless, because it's invisible until it isn't. Stay with me. I'm going to show you exactly where it's hiding. Let's talk about the raise. Remember the first time you got a real one? Not the cost of living bump. A real raise. Maybe you got promoted. Maybe you switched jobs and finally got paid what you were worth. You remember that feeling, that little exhale, like some tight band around your chest had loosened just slightly. And what did you do with that extra money? Be honest. Not with me. With yourself. Maybe you upgraded the car. Maybe the family started eating out a little more. Because you'd earned it, hadn't you? Maybe the vacations got a little nicer, the house got a little bigger, the thermostat got set to a more comfortable number without a second thought. None of that was reckless. None of that was wrong. That's the part that makes this so hard to see. Nothing you did looks like a mistake from the inside. Every single decision, on its own, was reasonable. Defensible. You worked hard. You deserved it. But here's what nobody said out loud while it was happening. Your spending grew exactly as fast as your income did. That's lifestyle creep. It doesn't feel like a trap while it's happening. It feels like progress. It feels like the reward for doing everything right. Your paycheck got bigger, and so, quietly, invisibly, did the life it was paying for. Every dollar of that raise found a home before it ever had the chance to find a retirement account. Think about it this way. Picture your income and your spending as 2 lines on a graph, moving upward together, year after year, decade after decade, always the same distance apart. That gap between them? That's supposed to be your future. That's supposed to be the part that gets saved, invested, protected. But for most people over 40, that gap never widens. It just moves upward, in lockstep, always the same size, no matter how much more they're making. You can be earning double what you made at 30 and still be saving the exact same percentage, which means, in real terms, you're no closer to retirement than you were 15 years ago. You're just living a more expensive version of not being ready. And here's the cruelest part of lifestyle creep. It disguises itself as success. You look around at your life at 47, at 52, and by every visible measure, you're doing well. Nice home, nice car, kids in good schools, friends who ask for your advice. Nobody looking at your life from the outside would ever guess that the retirement math doesn't work. That's exactly why it's so dangerous. There's no crisis moment, no single bad decision you can point to and say, that's where it went wrong. It's 1,000 small, sensible choices, compounding quietly in the wrong direction. Until one day, usually somewhere between 55 and 60. You sit down and actually do the math for the first time in years, and the number staring back at you doesn't match the life you thought you were building toward. I've talked to people in exactly that moment. The disbelief is always the same. But I make good money, they say. I don't understand how I'm behind. And the answer is always the same too. You were never behind on income. You were behind on the gap. The distance between what came in and what got saved. That's the only number that was ever going to get you to the finish line. And it's the one number that lifestyle creep quietly erodes year after year without ever sending up a flare. So let me ask you the question I think you've been avoiding. If your income doubled tomorrow, would your savings rate double with it? Or would your life just get a little more comfortable, a little more padded, a little more expensive, the way it always has? That answer tells you almost everything about where you'll actually be standing at 65. The fix isn't complicated, but it is uncomfortable. It means treating every raise, every bonus, every windfall as a fork in the road instead of a reward already spent in your head before it lands. It means deciding, before the money arrives, not after, what percentage of it goes to your future self, and holding that line even when the new car, the nicer vacation, the bigger house all feel so reasonable in the moment, because they always feel reasonable in the moment. That's what makes this trap so effective. It never asks you to make one big bad decision. It just asks you, quietly, 100 times a year, to choose comfort now over security later. And most people say yes, without ever realizing they were being asked a question at all. I think about a couple I once heard about. Both in their early 50s, both doing well by every outward measure. 2 incomes, a house in a good neighborhood, a couple of nice vacations every year. When they finally looked honestly at their numbers, they found something that shook them. Their combined income had nearly tripled since their 30s. Their savings rate had barely moved. Not because they were foolish, because every increase for 20 years had quietly found a new place to live before it ever reached an account with their future's name on it. Here's the piece that matters most, and it's the piece almost nobody says out loud. This isn't about deprivation. The people who get this right aren't the ones who refuse every nice dinner or every upgrade. They're the ones who simply decided in advance that some fixed piece of every increase, a number chosen before the money ever arrives, belongs to the person they'll be at 68. Everything else they get to enjoy without guilt, because the future was already accounted for first. That single habit, repeated for 20 or 30 years, is often the entire difference between a retirement where you're counting every dollar and one where you finally get to exhale. There's a sentence that gives people a false sense of peace more than almost any other in personal finance. 4 words. I have a 401k. Say it out loud sometime. Notice how solid it sounds, how responsible. Like a box that's been checked, a problem that's been handled. You contribute a little from every paycheck. Maybe your employer matches some of it. And somewhere in the back of your mind, that fact sits there doing a job it was never actually equipped to do, reassuring you that you're fine. But having a 401k is not the same as having a plan. And that distinction is one of the most expensive things most people over 40 don't understand until it's far too late to fix. Here's what actually happens for the vast majority of people. They start a job. HR hands them a form. Somebody, a well-meaning coworker, a generic online article, a default setting in the enrollment software, tells them to contribute somewhere around 10 to 15%. They pick a target date fund without really reading what's inside it. And then they stop thinking about it. Not because they're lazy, because the system is built to make you feel like thinking about it further isn't necessary. The contribution comes out automatically. The statement arrives, gets glanced at, gets filed away. Out of sight and very much out of mind. The number 10 to 15% was never about you. It's an average. It's a rule of thumb built for a hypothetical person with a hypothetical income, a hypothetical retirement age, and hypothetical expenses. Someone who doesn't exist, living a life that isn't yours. It doesn't know that you live in a high cost of living area. It doesn't know you started saving seriously at 38 instead of 25. It doesn't know you want to retire at 62, or that you're supporting a parent, or that you're hoping to help your kids with a down payment someday. It's a placeholder dressed up as a plan. And so people over 40 walk around with a number in their head. I'm contributing, they tell themselves, without ever having calculated the number that actually matters. What do I need this account to be worth by the day I stop working, in order to fund the life I actually want to live after that? That number is not intuitive. It's not something you feel your way toward. It requires sitting down and doing real arithmetic. How many years until retirement? How much you'll need annually to live the way you want? How long that money needs to last? What inflation does to it along the way? What return you can realistically expect? Most people have never once done that calculation. Not because it's impossible, because it's uncomfortable. And because the illusion of I'm contributing feels so much better than the discomfort of finding out you might be 20 years and several $100,000 behind where you need to be. I want you to picture something. Imagine building a house without ever knowing how big it needs to be. You just keep laying bricks, a few every week, feeling productive, feeling responsible. You never stop to ask, how many rooms do I need? How many people will live here? You just build and assume that at some point it will be enough because you were always building something. That's what contributing to my 401k without a real target feels like. Motion mistaken for progress, effort mistaken for a plan, and the discovery, when it comes, tends to come late. Often in the 5 to 10 years right before retirement, when someone finally sits down, maybe with an advisor, maybe alone at the kitchen table with a calculator, and runs the actual numbers for the first time. And what they find is a gap, not a small one. A gap between the life they pictured, travel, grandkids, some breathing room, and the life the math is actually pointing toward. That gap isn't a moral failing. It's not because you were careless. It's because for 20 or 30 years, the entire system, the automatic enrollment, the generic percentages, the set it and forget it language everyone uses, was designed to make you feel finished with a task you had, in reality, never fully started. The people who avoid this trap aren't smarter. They're not luckier. They just did one uncomfortable thing earlier than everyone else. They stopped asking, am I contributing? And started asking, is this enough, and enough for what, exactly? That single shift in the question changes everything downstream from it. It turns a vague, comforting habit into an actual target you can measure yourself against, adjust for, and, most importantly, still have time to correct. Because here's the part that matters most. Especially if you're 45 or 50 or even 55 right now, listening to this and feeling that quiet drop in your stomach. There is still time. Not unlimited time, but time. The people who get hurt aren't the ones who find the gap. It's the ones who never look for it at all. I think of a man I heard about who did this exercise at 54, half expecting to feel worse afterward. He didn't. He felt something closer to relief. Not because the number was small. It wasn't. But because for the first time in 15 years, he wasn't guessing anymore. He knew exactly how far he had to go, and exactly how many years he had to close that distance. That clarity, uncomfortable as it was for an afternoon, turned into the most productive decade of saving he'd ever had. Because you cannot fix a gap you've never allowed yourself to measure. There's a number a lot of people over 40 are quietly leaning on. They don't say it out loud very often, but it's there, sitting underneath their retirement math like a foundation they've never actually inspected. That number is Social Security. Somewhere along the way, a lot of us absorbed the idea that Social Security would be there to catch us, not carry the whole weight, but catch a meaningful chunk of it. Enough that the rest of the plan didn't have to be perfect. Enough that if the 401k came up a little short, Social Security would help close the gap. Here's the number that quietly breaks that assumption. For most people, Social Security replaces somewhere around 40% of pre-retirement income. Not 40% of your expenses in retirement, 40% of what you were earning while you were working. And if you were a higher earner, that percentage is often even lower because the program is intentionally designed to replace a smaller share of income for people who made more. Sit with that for a second. 40%. That means if you were bringing home, say, $6,000 a month before retirement, Social Security is likely to hand you somewhere around $2,400, not $6,000, not even half, once you account for the way the percentages actually work at higher income levels. $2,400 to cover a life that, in your head, still costs what it costs right now. That gap between what people expect and what the program actually delivers isn't a rounding error. It's often the difference between a comfortable retirement and a frightening one. And here's what makes this particular trap so insidious. The confusion isn't really anyone's fault. Nobody sits you down at 25 and explains, clearly and specifically, what Social Security is actually built to do. It exists in the cultural background as a vague promise. Don't worry, you'll have Social Security. Said the way people say, don't worry, it'll all work out. Comforting and almost entirely without substance. So people build their mental math around an unexamined assumption. They picture their current expenses, minus a little belt tightening, and they assume Social Security plus their savings will get them there. And because that mental math never gets stress tested, never gets pulled out into the light and actually calculated, it stays comfortable right up until the year before retirement, when someone finally logs into their Social Security account, looks at the real estimated benefit, and feels the floor shift slightly under their feet. I think about this the way I think about a bridge. You don't want to find out how much weight it can hold while you're standing in the middle of it. You want to know that number years in advance, while you still have time to build a second support, reinforce what's already there, or choose a different crossing altogether. But most people don't check. They just assume the bridge was built for the weight they're planning to put on it. The other layer to this, the one that catches even people who do understand the 40% number, is timing. When you claim Social Security changes how much you receive, permanently for the rest of your life. Claim early, at 62, and the check is meaningfully smaller than if you'd waited until your full retirement age. Wait until 70 And it grows larger still, sometimes dramatically so. That single decision, often made under financial pressure or simply out of impatience, can be worth hundreds of thousands of dollars over the course of a retirement. And most people make it without ever running the actual comparison, because nobody explained to them that this wasn't a small technical detail. It was one of the biggest financial decisions of their entire life, disguised as paperwork. None of this means Social Security isn't real or isn't valuable. It is. For a lot of people, it's the one piece of retirement income that's guaranteed, inflation-adjusted, and impossible to outlive. That's genuinely rare and genuinely worth respecting. But respecting it means seeing it clearly, as a meaningful piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. As a floor, not a foundation you build the entire house on. The people who navigate this well aren't the ones who ignore Social Security, and they're not the ones who distrust it either. They're the ones who took the time, years before they needed the check, to find out exactly what number they were actually working with, and built the rest of their plan around the truth, instead of around the comforting story they'd been telling themselves since they were 25 years old. I'd ask you to picture the difference between two people, both turning 62, both with nearly identical savings. One has spent the last decade assuming Social Security would cover roughly half their expenses. The other actually logged in, actually pulled the real estimate, actually ran the timing scenarios. On the surface, at 61, their lives look almost identical. By 75, they don't look identical at all, because one of them built a plan around a guess, and the other built one around a number. Let me tell you about a version of financial ruin that never makes headlines. No dramatic crash, no scandal. Just one phone call. It's your adult son, and he needs help with rent, just for a few months, just until he gets back on his feet. Or it's a diagnosis, yours or your spouse's. And suddenly, there are costs insurance doesn't fully cover, and there's no version of no that feels possible. Or it's your mother, and the assisted living facility costs more per month than your mortgage ever did, and there's no one else to make that decision but you. Or it's a marriage that quietly, painfully comes apart in your 50s, and the retirement account you spent 30 years building gets split down the middle overnight. Here's what nobody tells you about these moments. They don't feel like financial decisions while they're happening. They feel like love, like duty, like the only human thing to do. And that's exactly why almost nobody plans for them. Most retirement math is built like a smooth, predictable line. Contribute steadily, let it compound, retire on schedule. But real life doesn't move in a smooth line. Real life moves in one long stretch of ordinary years, and then, without warning, one event that doesn't care about your spreadsheet at all. I want you to think back over the last 20 years of your life, honestly. How many of those unplanned, non-negotiable expenses have already happened? A parent's health crisis, a child who needed more than expected, later than expected, a layoff at the worst possible time, something with your own body that insurance didn't fully cover. If you're over 40, chances are you can already name at least one. And chances are, whatever savings plan you had before that event happened, it wasn't built to absorb it. That's the blind spot. Not that these things happen. Everyone half expects that something eventually will. The blind spot is that almost nobody builds an actual buffer for it. People build a retirement plan for the years that go according to plan, and then treat every disruption as an emergency to be handled in the moment, usually by pulling from savings that were never meant to be touched, or worse, by pausing contributions entirely during exactly the years compound growth needed most to do its work. Think of retirement savings like a young tree. The years you don't touch it, the years you let it grow undisturbed, are the years that matter most, because growth compounds on top of growth. Cut into it in year 15, right when the roots are finally deep enough to weather a storm, and you don't just lose what you took out. You lose everything that money would have become by the time you needed it. That's what one big expense does in your late 40s or 50s. It's not just the dollar amount that hurts. It's the years of compounding that dollar amount would have quietly generated, gone, permanently, at exactly the moment in the timeline when there's the least time left to rebuild. And here's the part that stings the most. These expenses are rarely a surprise in the abstract. Most people over 40 know, somewhere in the back of their mind, that a parent will likely need care someday, that an adult child might stumble before they find their footing, that a marriage under enough pressure can break. They know the categories. They just never assign them a number or a plan, because doing so feels almost like inviting the event to happen. So instead, people hope. And hope is not a financial strategy. It's the absence of one, dressed up to feel like optimism. The people who weather these moments without losing a decade of progress are rarely the ones with the most money. They're the ones who, at some point, sat down and asked an uncomfortable question. If something big and unplanned happened to someone I love, or to me, what would I actually do? And where would that money come from? Not in a panic, in the moment, in advance, with a clear head, and a buffer already built for exactly that purpose. Because the truth is, the plan was never going to be tested by the years that went well. It was always going to be tested by the one that didn't. I think about this the way a builder thinks about a structure in earthquake country. Nobody builds a house assuming the ground will never shake. They build in a margin, a little extra steel, a foundation slightly deeper than it needs to be on a calm day, because the calm days were never the point. The point was always the day the ground moved. Your retirement plan deserves that same kind of margin, not because you expect the worst, because you respect the fact that somewhere in the next 20 years, life is going to ask you for something you didn't budget for. And the only question that matters is whether you'll have somewhere to turn that isn't your entire future. There's a moment a lot of people over 40 are counting down to, whether they say it out loud or not. The day the mortgage is finally paid off. The day that monthly payment, the biggest one in the budget, the one that's been there for 20, 25, 30 years, simply disappears. And when people picture retirement, that moment does a lot of quiet, heavy lifting in their imagination. Once the house is paid off, they tell themselves, things will finally feel manageable. It becomes the finish line, the thing that makes all the other numbers feel less frightening. Because surely once you own your home outright, the hardest part of the financial puzzle is solved. I need to gently take that apart, because it's one of the most common and most costly misunderstandings people carry into retirement. Owning your home outright means you no longer owe anyone for the house itself. It does not mean the house has stopped costing money, and for a lot of people, that distinction doesn't fully land until they're already retired, living on a fixed income and staring at a stack of bills that never got the memo that the mortgage was gone. Property taxes don't disappear when the mortgage does. In a lot of places, they keep climbing every single year, sometimes faster than any fixed income can keep up with. Homeowners insurance doesn't disappear either. And in more and more parts of the country, it's been climbing sharply, not gently. And then there's the cost that catches people most off guard of all: maintenance. A roof doesn't care that you're retired. A water heater doesn't wait for a convenient year to fail. An aging HVAC system, a driveway that needs repaving, a foundation that needs attention. These costs don't ask permission, and they don't shrink just because your income has. Here's the phrase for what happens next, and it's one worth sitting with. House rich, cash poor. It's the situation where, on paper, someone looks financially solid. They own a home worth a significant amount of money. And yet, month to month, they're stretched thin, sometimes dangerously thin, because nearly all of their actual liquid income is being absorbed by the ongoing cost of keeping that home standing. Think about what a paid-off house actually is, financially. It's not cash. It's not income. It's not something you can use to pay the electric bill or fill a prescription. It's equity, value that's real, but frozen, locked inside four walls, doing nothing to help with the cost of living unless you sell it, borrow against it, or find some other way to convert it into something spendable. Meanwhile, the taxes, the insurance, and the maintenance keep arriving as real, liquid, non-negotiable bills, month after month, whether the house has a mortgage on it or not. This is why so many retirees who did everything right, paid off the house early, avoided debt, felt proud of that milestone, still find themselves anxious every time something breaks. Not because they were careless, because the finish line they'd been picturing, the house will be paid off, and then I'll be fine, was only ever half the picture. It solved for one number and quietly ignored several others that don't go away, and in many parts of the country, keep growing. The people who avoid this particular trap aren't the ones who refuse to pay off their mortgage. It's not an argument against that milestone. It's a real and meaningful one. The difference is that they don't stop the math there. They ask a further question. Once the mortgage is gone, what will it actually still cost me every year just to keep living in this house? Taxes, insurance, upkeep. And does my retirement income comfortably cover that number? Or am I quietly assuming the hard part is already behind me? Because a paid-off house can be one of the greatest gifts you give your future self. Or it can be a beautiful, heavy anchor, something you're equity-rich in and cash-poor around, unable to sell without uprooting your entire life, and unable to comfortably stay without a level of financial strain nobody warned you was still coming, even after the debt itself was gone. I've heard the same sentence from more retirees than I can count, always said with the same tired disbelief. I thought paying off the house was supposed to make this easier. It does make things easier. Just not as easier as the finish line story led them to believe. The people who avoid that disappointment are the ones who, years before retirement, sat down and priced out what their specific home, in their specific area, would actually cost to simply exist in: taxes, insurance, upkeep, and made sure their retirement income could carry that number comfortably, with room to spare for the roof that will eventually need replacing. None of this is an argument against owning your home free and clear. It's still, for most people, one of the wisest financial decisions of a lifetime. The argument is against stopping the thinking there, against treating one real milestone as though it were the entire finish line. If you've stayed with me this far, I want to pause, just for a moment, and say something directly to you. I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel and to come back and sit with me here again. Not because I need the number to go up, because if what I've said in the last few minutes has landed anywhere in you, even quietly, That probably means you're exactly the kind of person this channel is for. Someone who's done the responsible things and still feels that low hum of uncertainty underneath it all. I'd rather have 100 people like that watching every day than 10,000 who scroll past. And I want to say one more thing before we go back. If any part of what you've heard so far made your stomach tighten a little. The lifestyle creep, the 401k number you've never actually calculated, the Social Security estimate you've never really checked, that reaction isn't a sign that something's wrong with you. It's a sign that some part of you already knew. You've probably felt this before, in quieter moments. Lying awake at 1 a.m. doing math you couldn't finish, glancing at a friend's new boat or their kid's wedding, and feeling something you couldn't quite name. That feeling has a name. It's not envy, and it's not failure. It's the sound of a gap between the life you're living and the life you're planning for, finally getting loud enough to hear. Good. That's not a bad thing. That's the beginning of the only thing that actually fixes any of this. Seeing it clearly, because here's what all 5 of these traps have in common. And it's worth saying plainly. Lifestyle creep, the 401k illusion, the Social Security miscalculation, the one big expense nobody planned for, the debt-free home that turns out to still cost plenty. Every single one of them shares the same quiet mechanism. None of them announce themselves. None of them feel, in the moment, like a mistake. They feel like normal life, reasonable choices made by a reasonable person, one at a time, over decades. And that's exactly what makes them dangerous. A trap you can see coming, you step around. A trap you can't see is the only kind that actually catches people. And I think that's the real story underneath everything I've told you today. It's not that people over 40 are bad with money. Most of them aren't. It's that the entire system, the culture, the marketing, the vague inherited wisdom passed down from people who didn't fully understand it either, was never built to make the real numbers visible. It was built to make you feel finished. Contributing? You're fine. House paid off? You're fine. Got Social Security coming? You're fine. Each one a small, comforting lie, not told with malice, just told because nobody ever slowed down enough to check if it was true. So let me ask you something, and I want you to actually answer it, not just let it pass by. Of the 5 traps I've walked through with you, lifestyle creep, the 401k illusion, the Social Security gap, the unplanned expense, the paid-off house that still costs money, which one made something in you go quiet for a second? Which one felt less like information and more like recognition? That's the one worth sitting with tonight. Because here's what I've learned. In the years I've spent talking to people about exactly this, the ones who end up okay are almost never the ones who had the highest income, or the fewest setbacks, or the smartest advisor. They're the ones who, at some point, stopped letting the vague, comforting version of the story stand in for the real one. They ran the numbers, even when the numbers were uncomfortable. They asked, specifically, what does my life actually cost? What will Social Security actually replace? What does this house actually cost me once the mortgage is gone? What happens if something big and unplanned lands on my family? And then they built toward the true number instead of the reassuring one. That shift doesn't require you to be rich. It doesn't require you to be young. It requires you to be willing to look, really look, at something you've been avoiding, possibly for years, because looking felt scarier than not knowing. But not knowing was never actually safer. It just felt safer. And there's a difference between those two things that most people don't discover until it's very, very expensive to discover it. You still have time. That's not a comforting cliche. It's a fact. If you're 45, or 52, or even 58 right now, listening to this, the years ahead of you are still yours to shape. But only if you're willing to trade the story that felt good for the number that's actually true. I want to leave you with one more image before we close this out, because I think it matters. Somewhere out there is a version of you, 10 years from now, looking back at this exact moment, this video, this evening, whatever you're doing right now, while you listen. That future version of you already knows which of these 5 traps mattered most. They already know whether tonight was the night something shifted, or just another night this idea passed through and quietly left again. You get to decide, right now, which one of those 2 nights this turns out to have been. Let's finish this together. There's an image I keep coming back to, again and again, one I want to leave you with tonight. Picture a man standing in a house he built himself, brick by brick, over 30 years. Every room added with care. Every wall load-bearing, every choice, at the time, the right one. And one day, late in life, he steps back to really look at the whole structure for the first time. Not admiring it, just checking it. And he notices something. A room he never finished. A foundation that was poured for a smaller house than the one he ended up living in. Nothing collapsed. Nothing burned down. It's just not quite what he thought it was, standing this close to it, this late in the build. That's not a tragedy. That's just what happens when nobody ever stops to check the blueprint against the actual lived-in structure. And the good news, the only real good news in any of this, is that a house can still be reinforced. Rooms can still be finished. Foundations can be widened, even late, even after 30 years, as long as somebody's willing to look honestly at what's actually there instead of what they assumed was there. That's really all this video has been. Not a warning, not a scare, a blueprint check. Lifestyle creep. The quiet way a bigger paycheck builds a bigger life instead of a bigger cushion. The 401k illusion. The comfort of contributing standing in for the discomfort of actually calculating what's needed. The Social Security Miscalculation. A program built to replace a floor, mistaken for a foundation. The one big expense nobody plans for. The phone call that turns 30 years of steady saving into a single hard decision. And the debt-free home, the finish line that turns out to be a checkpoint with real costs still waiting on the other side of it. 5 traps, all quiet, all reasonable looking from the inside, all still, right now, tonight, sitting somewhere in your own numbers, waiting to be looked at honestly, or waiting to be looked at when there's a lot less room left to fix them. I'm not going to tell you which one applies to you. You already know. It surfaced somewhere in the last hour, in a specific sentence, at a specific moment, and some part of you went quiet when it did. Sit with that quiet. Don't rush past it. It's not trying to hurt you. It's trying to get your attention, gently, before something far more expensive eventually does. If this video gave you something worth sitting with tonight, honestly and without rushing past it, do 3 things for me. Subscribe to the channel and come back. Not for me, but because this is the kind of conversation worth having more than once. Share this with 5 people. Not because I need the numbers to grow, but because I promise you, someone in your life, a sibling, a friend from college, someone you sit across from at Thanksgiving, is carrying one of these exact 5 traps right now, silently, and has never once heard anyone say it out loud the way we just did together. You sharing this might be the thing that gets them to finally check their own blueprint and leave a comment, not a generic one. Tell me honestly which of these 5 hit closest to home. There's no wrong answer, and you're not alone in whichever one it is. I promise you that. And while you're there, tell me what you want me to dig into next. What question about money, about aging, about the years ahead, has been sitting unanswered in the back of your mind? I read every one, and this channel gets built from exactly those conversations. You did everything you were told to do. That was never really the problem. The problem was that nobody ever told you to check the math behind the advice. So check it. Not someday, this week. The years ahead of you are still yours to build. And if you take just one thing from the next hour of your life, let it be this: you were never as far behind as the silence made you feel, and you're not as safe as the comfort made you believe. The truth is somewhere in between, waiting for you to go find it, on paper, with real numbers, before someone else finds it for you. Thank you for spending this time with me. It wasn't wasted. Whatever you do with it next, that part's up to you now. And it always was.